Well, a few years ago, back in 2015, not very long ago, but a few years ago, a Gallup poll was taken here in the U.S., and it revealed the following information. Of those who took this poll, 75% of them indicated that they were Christians. That was down from 78% just a few years earlier in 2012, down from 81.6% in 2001, and down from 85% in 1990. We're not going to deal with that progression today, but it is a good reminder in just 25 years, 10% less, simply meaning there's a world around us who needs our invitation, who needs to know the gift of God in their lives. Keep talking, keep inviting. Further, the poll found this, though. 75% indicated they were Christians. 62% of those surveyed indicated that they were members of a congregation of some kind. Now, I share those stats as we begin so that we might then ask this question. And I don't mean this judgmentally. Sometimes it can be heard that way. I simply know that this is a very important question. Of that 75%, or of that 62% for that matter, I wonder how many of them have a faith that actually impacts, influences their daily living. And the reason that is such an important question to ask when you look at statistics like that is for this reason. Because that's a question we better be asking ourselves each and every day as well. Recognizing that a strong faith, recognizing that a genuine faith that will always make itself known through how we live our lives. Today we continue our series, Beyond Ordinary. And as we do so, we want to take a look at that very question, that very thought. Exploring that question specifically today by taking a look at the life of Abraham, a very important character that we find in the Old Testament. And why are we taking a look today at Abraham's life? For this reason. Because here was someone whose faith was made very visible through some tests that he faced, or through some tests that he went through. And knowing that these are tests that we also face in this life, my hope for us today is this: that we might learn how we are to best deal with them by looking at how he dealt with them. So here are the 4 tests that Abraham faced. The first test that he faced as he began his journey, and I really want you to think of it this way, as he began his journey into being used by God in extraordinary ways, the first test he faced as he began to do that was this: the test of a major change in his life. Most of us, perhaps all of us to some degree, we don't like change very much. So the first test for him was the test of a major change in his life, one that he had to move into without knowing very much at all about where this change would take him. Here's Hebrews 11, verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, he obeyed and he went, hear this, even though he did not know where he was going. Guys, imagine this person of faith, this person of great faith. He is serving God well in a city that he's been in for quite some time now. He's probably even thinking that Haran, that's where he is. He's probably even thinking that that is the city he'll live in till the day he dies. Imagine in the midst of that, God leading Abraham into a major change in his life, leading him into that change by calling him to move to a new city. What makes this even more interesting is this: though God calls him to move, God doesn't tell him where he's moving to. Nonetheless, here is Abraham's response. Verse 8, Abraham moved immediately, even though he did not know where he was going. Think for a moment about how that applies to our lives. Guys, some of you who are here today, you're being tested right now by this very thing. Meaning you are currently facing a major change in your life right now. Might be a change of jobs because you lost yours. Might be a change in your marriage or another significant relationship because things have been a struggle. Might be a change in location as well as you face retirement and consider living in a different location in the midst of that. Or maybe we're talking about a change in your health because you've just started battling a very serious illness. Whatever it might be, truth is, for many of you, change is the thing that is testing your faith right now. And in order to see your faith as strong in the midst of that, here's what you've got to be looking for. Are you following God's lead even though you don't know where this change is taking you? Or maybe let's ask it this way. Are you maybe getting stuck in the where, and that's getting in the way of you simply moving forward, simply being faithful? Guys, in our world today, we will from time to time face major changes. And with each one, if we want to stand strong in our faith, we've got to follow Abraham's lead. Abraham moved immediately, even though he did not know where. First today, ask yourself, is this a test that you're facing in your life right now? And if so, how are you doing? In other words, is the question of where, God, where is this leading me? Sometimes we speak those words in desperation, honestly. Is the question of where something that you need to give to God right now? Because it is getting in the way of your being used by Him fully. Here's the second test that Abraham faced. Again, one that we too face from time to time. The test of delay. Guys, if we don't like change, we also don't like delay very much either, honestly. Here's verse 9. By faith, Abraham made his home in the promised land, hear this, like a stranger in a foreign country, and he lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. Here's what we've got to understand when it comes to this part of Abraham's life. Even though God has very, very clearly said to him, Abraham, if you move, I will give you the land of Israel. Even though God has promised him this clearly, when Abraham actually gets to where God has sent him, here's what he finds. That there's now going to be a delay when it comes to when he can actually fully settle there. Instead, for a time, he'll be living in tents instead of building a true life there. It's that delay that leads Abraham into this second test in his life, one that, again, we often face as well. The test of trying to. Think of it this way, because this is tough. The test of trying to function really well in life, even though we don't know when things are going to be resolved for us. That can be very difficult. To embrace life fully, even when we wonder when things in our lives will get better. If first a person of faith is someone who follows God's leading, even though they don't know where God is leading them, then secondly, a person of faith is also willing to do this, to trust in God's timing without really knowing when, so to speak. Ask yourself, secondly, today, perhaps has the when question got you down right now? God, when is this going to end? When is this going to be resolved? If it has, then how might you, just like you did with the where question, how might you also give the question of when to God? Knowing that if you don't, then that too will continue to get in the way of God using you in important ways. Here's the third test that Abraham faced. The test of a really big problem in his life, a problem that actually came out of one of the promises that God had made to him. Here's verse 11. By faith, Abraham, even though he was past age and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father because he considered God faithful who had made the promise to him. Guys, hear this today. God had promised Abraham that one day he would be the father of a great nation. He would be the father of the nation of Israel. That's the promise. The problem connected to that at this point in Abraham's life is this. He's 99 years old and he still has no children. It's into the midst of that what we might see as an insurmountable problem. It is certainly how Sarah, perhaps even more than Abraham, thought of this. In the midst of that insurmountable problem, or so it seemed, God sent some messengers to Abraham and his wife Sarah, and the messengers came to simply say this: guys, this is still going to happen. You've got to trust that. That being said, here was their response to that message. And this might make you feel a little bit better when you think of sometimes how you respond to God calling you to things. Here was their response, or at least Sarah's response. Are you ready? She laughed. And to unpack that a little bit, we've really got to think about this. Why did she laugh? She laughed, and we perhaps would have done the same thing. She laughed because, human being that she was, she knew that the problem they faced was bigger than even what God could handle. Now, of course, as we know the rest of the story, when a child is born, who has the last laugh? God has the last laugh. But nonetheless, imagine them in those moments struggling greatly with how might God handle this? Guys, let's face it. Some of you who are gathered here today are worried sick about something in your life right now, and you're worried about it in big ways because you feel like you are facing a situation that seems pretty impossible. If that's the case for you, then once again, you've got to take your cue from Abraham. Because through what he does, here's what we see. We see what a person of strong faith, that's what we want to be. We see what a person of strong faith would do. They'd expect God's help, even though they can't imagine how he's going to be able to help them. They would trust in God's help, even though it's difficult for them to see how he's going to be able to fix things. Again, a third time with Abraham's example before you, thirdly ask yourself, has the how question got you down a bit? And if so, what might you do in order to give that to God? Guys, even as Abraham battled through the tests of a major change, a delay, a big problem, even as he dealt with those three things, the toughest test was yet to come, because lastly he faced this test. The test of facing a possible tragedy in his life. Listen to how the writer of Hebrews speaks to this. Here's Hebrews 11, now verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac his son as the sacrifice. He reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. Now, let me just say this when it comes to this part of the story. Whether we are reading this here in Hebrews, or whether we are looking at the fuller story in the Old Testament, understandably so, many of us really struggle with this part of the Abraham story. Why? We think this is a terrible thing that God is asking Abraham to do. But here's the deal. We struggle so much with that because we get stuck in the wrong place. How could God ask him to sacrifice his son? And here's what I mean by that. With many of the passages you find in Scripture, especially passages you find in the Old Testament, there's one key meaning that we're supposed to zero in on. Here, our focus is not supposed to be on the request. Instead, here, our focus is supposed to be squarely on Abraham's response to this difficult request. Because here's that response. Even though Abraham can't understand at all why what is happening, doesn't get the why, even though that is the case for him, nonetheless, what does he do? He fully puts his trust in God. And in that is our final lesson today. That final lesson being this, that especially when we find ourselves in the most difficult of times, especially then, we've got to trust that God's love for us is bigger than any why we can imagine. Guys, here's what's real. There are many things in our world today that don't make sense. They're things that regularly cause us to ask the question, why? But here's the question. Can we in those moments, especially when we're dealing with a why that is very, very personal, can we in those moments truly follow Abraham's lead here? Because it's critical that we do so. Back in 1993, when I lost my dad pretty suddenly, I remember at that time, in the midst of the shock and the loss and just all of that, I remember getting so stuck for a while in the whys of it all, so to speak. I think why is such a natural response in situations like that. And gosh, I had a lot of them. My why kind of sounded like this to some degree. You know, why did I have to lose my father at such a young age? I was 29, he was 57. Why did I now have to move forward without him? I still think that sometimes today. I'd love to ask his advice with this or with that. Or how about this why? This is always a fun one. As human beings, we go here. The why of, why didn't I say this and this and this to him when I talked to him the last time? You know, how can we know? And yet that's a why that churns through us. Not so much today, but still to some degree. Bottom line, in the midst of that loss, with why after why after why just churning through me, it was pretty hard for God to do what? It was pretty hard for God to use me in important ways in ministry. Which meant, with God's help, here's what I had to do if I wanted to get back on track. I had to trust in God's love, even though I would never, ever know why this had happened. I share that with you today in order to say this, that while there are many whys in life that will never be answered, and you've got your share as we gather, though there are many whys in life that will never be answered, we still have a choice when it comes to them. And so again, knowing that, ask yourself lastly, are you letting your struggle with why maybe get in the way of God using you in important ways? Or Are you finding ways, like I eventually did? Are you finding ways to also release the why into God's hands? I really want to encourage you today and this week. I want to encourage you to honestly look at your life, more specifically, honestly look at your faith, and then test it out. To do that, to consider how strong it really is, look at the 4 things we've just considered today, linking them to these 4 questions. Do you find yourself on a consistent basis in your life right now? Do you find yourself consistently following God's leading well, even when you don't know where He's taking you for sure? Or are you on a consistent basis in your life right now? Are you willing to trust in God's timing, even when you don't know when something, perhaps something big, is going to resolve in your life? Further, are you able on a consistent basis in your life right now? Are you able to expect God to help you, trust God to help you, even when you can't imagine how He's going to be able to do that? You trust nonetheless. And then lastly, honestly, are you on a consistent basis? Are you trusting in God's love for you, even when you're not sure or you're devastated by why some things have happened? I ask these questions in closing, and I ask them in just this way, because answering yes to each of these might not just point to the fact that you do have a strong faith, you are striving to grow in your walk with Christ each day. I ask these questions also in this way, for this reason, because answering yes to each of them, that also more than likely says this about you, that you are daily putting yourself in a position to be used by God. Because you know what? You are needed. Right where you are in your circle of influence, your gifts, your talents, your spirit, your presence, you are needed. So work at saying yes to these very things. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen.